Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of r/Nuclear Revenge. In today's episode, drive over a kid's bike, pay the price. They stole my computer, so I found them and got them arrested in 24H. An attorney's dream case, my parents versus the bank. Before we get started, make sure to subscribe so you will never miss a video. So let's get started. Drive over a kid's bike, pay the price. Okay, this story took place a very long time ago, in the summer of 1969. I was about 12. I had an early morning paper route in my neighborhood. One of the first things that I bought with my earnings was a brand new 10-speed bike. It was silver with red trim. I was really proud of it, and I took very good care of it. I also used it to deliver my newspapers in the morning. One of my customers was often leaving for work around the time that I got there. I always made a point of parking my bike well off to the side while I went up to deliver his paper. This particular morning, he turned too soon and too sharply while backing out of his driveway, and backed right over my bikes, ruining the front sprocket and derailleur. He stuck his head out the window and asked, "Is it okay?" "Not exactly," I said. "Well, that's what you get for leaving it behind my car." Then he drove off. I walked it home, crushed and upset. I felt helpless against this adult who clearly had no intention of doing anything about it, and I didn't know what to do. My hurt, frustration, and powerlessness gradually turned to anger. I stopped delivering his paper, and when he complained, I told my supervisor that I was delivering, but he just liked to complain. So ultimately, it wasn't held against me. But the real revenge was yet to come. He lived on the main route through the neighborhood that all the kids took to go to the local 7-Eleven and other places. His mailbox sat on a steel fence post loosely set into the ground. That summer, I got in the habit of pulling it up and throwing it over the fence into the cemetery across the street, maybe once or twice a week. It was fun and mischievous, but it still didn't satisfy my need for revenge. He had 3 large frond shrubs in his front yard that would grow to 6 or 8 feet over the course of the summer and then begin to die back. They were several feet apart, with nothing else close by. One August evening, I threw a lit match into one on my way home from the 7-Eleven. I never heard anything else, but on my route the next morning, it was just a burnt husk in his front yard. Over the next couple weeks, I did the same to the other 2. I was beginning to feel a bit satisfied. But one morning, on the way home from delivering papers, I had an inspiration. I saw that the side window of his garage was open. Now, I knew that what I was considering was taking it a bit far. But I was an impulsive kid, and I thought tit for tat was fair. Back in the day, everybody carried road flares, aka emergency flares, in their cars. So I climbed through the window, found 2 flares, lit them, and stuck one right under/behind each of his rear tires, then climbed out and hightailed it home and went back to bed. I did not go back to see what happened, and I stayed away from the area for several days. I knew that I'd ruined his tires. I never saw the result, but I didn't care. And I never did another thing to him. If this post breaks any of NR's rules, please report it to the moderators for review. I am a bot, and this action was performed automatically. Please contact the moderators of this subreddit if you have any questions or concerns. I know other people will probably give you shit, but I love hearing stories about kids in the 60s to 70s. Probably went a bit far, but in your defense, he sounded like an asshole. Did you ever get your bike fixed? Yes. I found out that a guy in the neighborhood had a bike that'd been wrecked. I don't recall how now. But the front sprocket was intact. I do recall that I bought it from him for $10. And I replaced it myself. I already knew my way around a bike, so it wasn't too difficult. Back in the summer of '69. Yeah. I remember looking up at the moon one evening that summer and thinking to myself, There are men walking around there right now. It was kinda freaky. My oldest sister moved to Frisco the following year. The year after that, we took a vacation in the family station wagon. For you kids, that was the equivalent of a minivan, but no seatbelts, to move my sister back home. Pretty fun thing for a 14 years old to see California at that time. Reminds me of a story my grandpa told me once. He's telling me about how him and his brothers used to steal watermelons from a neighboring farmer. They lived across the river from him, so they'd float the watermelons and push them as they swam. Apparently, the farmer was not pleased with a bunch of little redneck assholes stealing his watermelons, so he would shoot at them with a shotgun. My grandpa said he was so upset when the watermelon he was pushing exploded right in front of him. But it all turned out alright, because him and his brothers burned down the farmer's shed. They stole my computer, so I found them and got them arrested in 24H. On a Friday night, I was at the Brussels train station on my way to the airport to fly to the US. I wasn't looking for a second, and my backpack containing my passport and my laptop was stolen. I tried following the AirTag on the map, but I had a huge suitcase and I was slow. When I got to the location, I found the AirTag on the ground. They had gotten rid of it. Then I went and filed a police report. To my surprise, an hour later, around midnight, my laptop showed up on the map. Let's call this location 1. I asked the police to help, but they said they couldn't because the location wasn't precise enough. I couldn't do much more and had to find new accommodations, so I did and went to bed. Saturday morning. The next morning, the computer appears at another address, location 2. I tell myself, F***ck it. I missed my flight because of these F***curs. I am stuck here until Monday when the embassy reopens. Let's make it the whole purpose of my weekend to find these F***curs. So I go to location 2 around 8 a.m. in the morning. I try knocking at a few of the apartments, nobody answers. So I decide to wait until someone comes out. 5 hours later, 2 men come out of the house under. I recognize and take photos of them. At first I thought about confronting them, but then I decided against it, which was good intuition because it would have been dangerous in retrospective. Instead, I decide to start tailing them. Saturday afternoon. To my surprise, the first stop the 2 thieves stop at an apartment building, which turns out to be location 1. I take photos and send them to the police. I wait for them and 30 minutes later they are on the move again and I follow. Then, they stop by at a computer store, which is where they resell the devices they steal. I take photos and send them to the police too. At this point, I think it's probably good to stop following them before they find me out. Anyway, I already had all the evidence I needed. So I return to where my computer is, at location 2, and wait for them to come back to call the police. Saturday night. After another 5 hours of waiting, no food or bathroom breaks because I didn't want to miss them, I finally see them coming back to their house. I call the police, they go in, they find my computer and give it back to me. They arrest one of 2 guys. The other got away minutes before the police arrived. In the house, they also find hundreds of stolen devices, computers, TVs, and smartphones wrapped up in aluminum paper. It turns out it was a considerable organized theft network. The police said it was the cavern of Alibaba, and that I was an investigator. If only there was some type of organization or group of professionals that specialized in these matters. Yes. This would be useful, every city should want one. Since it was a sting operation, which is like the bass player from that band, maybe they could call themselves the police. An attorney's dream case, my parents versus the bank. In 1973, my parents had enough money to build a little ranch house in the country. The small bank in town approved the mortgage and the bank signed a contract to give Bob the money to build the house. Bob, as it turns out, was overbooking himself all over town, leaving his clueless minions to do the actual work. The build took longer and longer, with more and more work having to be ripped out and redone. We're not talking about using the wrong color paint or nailing up some wonky trim here. The architect forgot to fully erase a line on the blueprints, and the framers built a wall through the bathtub. My mother was told don't put anything heavy in the kitchen cabinets because they were attached to the drywall, not the studs, using a few roofing nails through the back of each cabinet. The garage door opening was framed into the living room instead of towards the driveway. And so on. When the bank's representative showed up for the final inspection, my parents met him in the front yard and refused to sign off on Bob's work. Then representative became angry, as the bank had paid Bob a lot of money. He strode to the front door and pulled on the doorknob, whereupon the entire door, casing included, fell on him. It had simply been wedged, not nailed, into place. The bank called Bob, who finally showed up to supervise the work himself. The only problem was that Bob wasn't any better at building a house than his minions were. My parents still refused to sign off on the house. My mother was a somm in a nasty rental with 2 tiny children while my dad was working 2 jobs while this was going on. Throughout the entire process, the bank and Bob treated them very poorly, bullying my mom and lying to my dad. What should have been an exciting time for my parents was ruined. My mom cried a lot. My dad got depressed. Finally, the bank threatened my parents with foreclosure, and Bob threatened to sue my parents for breach of contract because the bank refused to pay him any more money. So my exhausted parents went to an attorney and gave him the rundown. Plumbing, electrical, tiling issues, the whole sorry mess. My parents were scared. All they had was their small down payment savings, so if this became a lengthy court battle, the bank and Bob would win. The attorney, Tom, was kind, but my dad said he could tell that he and Mom were doomed from Tom's facial expressions as he sorted through the paperwork. Then, abruptly, Tom smiled. "Let's get everyone together for a meeting," he told my parents. "Tomorrow." So my parents, Tom, the bank's representative, the bank's attorney, Bob, and Bob's attorney met at the bank. Tom didn't give anyone else time to begin. He said, "Well, my clients have decided that they no longer want this house. Please remove it." Everyone else started to laugh. "Remove it? Have you lost your mind?" Tom, in a sweeping, theatrical gesture, placed a deed on the table. "My clients own the land the house is sitting on outright. They no longer want the house. Get the house off my client's land." Bob's attorney stared at the deed and then turned and stared at Bob. "You built a house on land you don't own?" Bob nodded. The bank's attorney started yelling at the bank's representative. "You didn't finance the land the house is on?" The representative stammered, No." Tom said firmly, "As I said, gentlemen, you're trespassing on my client's land. I expect the house to be removed and the land returned to its original state at once." My dad said he'll remember the blank looks everyone on the other side of the table passed to one another for his whole life. Sure, the bank could foreclose on a house that wouldn't exist by the end of the week, with no way to recoup the money. They didn't even own the land it was on. Bob was out the 50% he'd paid out of pocket, plus he was on the hook for tearing down the house and removing it. On top of that, the bank would undoubtedly want him to repay the initial 50% they'd given him. Could they have gone after my parents? Sure. A foreclosure would have meant bad credit for my parents moving forward. They might lose their down payment. But to sign off on the house in its condition at that time would have meant thousands and thousands of dollars in cash to replace/repair everything from the roof to the basement before the house could be safely lived in. The bank knew my parents didn't have that kind of money. They're the ones who approved the mortgage. Suddenly, my parents were good people. It was all such a misunderstanding, and the bank and Bob couldn't do enough for them. The house was brought in line with the original blueprints and specifications immediately, at no extra cost to my parents, but at considerable cost to Bob. My parents signed the mortgage. Bob got the rest of his money, and just about broke even on the build. The bank's representative was fired. And Tom, attorney extraordinaire, got a stinging tale of triumph to recall to fellow attorneys for the rest of his life. Before you question this tale, please remember that 1973 was 50 years ago. Banks did things differently back then. Smaller rural banks, in particular, were not run the same way the bigger, city banks were. There were far fewer federal regulations, and in a smaller community people didn't always follow them, anyway. I'm pretty sure they don't always follow them now. Yes, they built a wall through the bathtub. No, I'm not making that up. I even left out how a plumber left his lunch bag on a partially built kitchen cabinet, but the cabinet maker didn't feel it was his job to move the bag, so he left it there and built the rest of the cabinet around it. I don't know where Bob found these people, but they were gems, every one of them. /S. Edit. I must admit that I'm immensely surprised at the traction this story has gotten. The bank and Bob put together very poorly written and pretty much unenforceable contracts. My parents' attorney figured this out and the bank and Bob had to back off. I thought this was interesting, but surely not the one and only time this happened. Aren't contracts being written all the time by clueless people? Is this really that unique? I guess we should be glad it is. Thanks for reading. I absolutely love this. I'll add that small towns back then likely played the good old boy game, and Bob and Banker were probably the best of friends. The inspector, if they existed, were likely part of it. Glad they got some justice and their dream house. Extra satisfying ending. I bet Tom told this story for years. What a legend. Banking was way different back then. When my parents built their first house in the mid-1960s, we lived in the house for 6 months before my mother signed the mortgage and deed. They had to wait until she was old enough to sign. Great story. I do imagine that this being prior to social media and all the scrutiny it comes with, that Bob was one of those cowboy builders, as we like to call them. There's certainly levels of quality, and I've seen a wide range on all kinds of homes I've inspected. This is probably some of the worst trade work I've read about, but not unheard of. Glad that Opie's parents got some revenge and restitution on their home. Those attorneys got the shock of their lives, and hopefully Bob never built anything larger than a birdhouse after this. If you made it to the end of the video, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe and share, and we will see you in the next video.